Hi folks, welcome back to Patrick's Scale Studio. I'll be your host, Patrick. Uh, we're going to follow on to the kit review I performed in my last video, and again for the USS Curtis Wilbur Guided Missile Destroyer 54 in scale 1/200 by I Love Kit. So if we open up the instructions here, you can see step one has got us adding a ton of stuff to the deck. So it looks like we've got the Tomahawk missile tubes that go with the vertical launch system, um, doors and small details, and items that go on that rear bulkhead of the main deck, further main deck or bulkhead pieces. And go from there to step two, where it has us mounting this deck and then the rear deck to the one-piece hull. Now, you remember I brought up the one-piece hull in the last video. It's a wonderful, wonderful molding. Everything's really nice and crisp, but because it's a slide mold, there are some mold seams here and there, especially one large mold seam running all the way across the bottom. Additionally, the hull is missing this bulbous area right down here at the bow. So if we go over here, that bulbous part is addressed in step three, along with bilge keels, propellers, shafts, and rudders. What I would like to do is take the instructions out of order a little bit and tackle this whole portion first, because we're going to paint this and then we can go back here, build this up, and add it to the hole that's already been painted and mounted. So another thing that we'll be doing while we're doing this is drilling holes through the hole so we can mount it on two brass pedestals, and then in turn mount that to a wooden base plate that looks nice. It'll look much nicer than I Love Kit's base plate that they included with the kit. So just a little bit of detail about this for the most part today. Going to be working on the mold seams and this bulbous part of the bow right here, because we need to integrate these so that they look like they're seamless. So we don't have the mold seams, it's nice and smooth, and then we want this to be a smooth transition from the hole up into this bulbous portion right here. These other pieces I'm not ultra concerned about as far as making sure that there's any kind of seamless transitions, because where they touch the hull is going to be an intersection, so there's going to be a natural shadow there anyway. So we don't have to make sure that there's any kind of seamless transition as much as there's no gaps. So I hope you'll stick around and follow along with me. Thanks. Alrighty. So as you can see here, I've got the hull pulled out, and I looked over it real quickly to see what flaws in the plastic there might be, so that I can go ahead and get those dealt with before I start actually even gluing anything on. Because I definitely want this to be just as nice and smooth as can be all the way around. Unfortunately, it's just a nature of the beast there. You're going to have mold lines, especially with slide molds. So on this side right here, I've already identified some just using a pencil. You can easily take your fingernail and run it across where you think you might have a mold seam, and you'll definitely be able to tell when your fingernail catches on that just a little bit there. So some of these are slight steps, or they might just be seams. We'll have to get into sanding them a little bit to figure out. But I find that it's very helpful to go through the entire piece first and check to see where those are and mark those up with a pencil. That helps me come back to where they are later on after I finish sanding down one area, so that I don't miss other areas. There's even one up here at the very front in the bow. You can see it right there. Again, just taking your fingernail. You can even hear it. You can feel it. So we mark that off. So we'll start over here with marking this off. Hopefully you all can see this. So I know that there's a mold seam right there. Now there's one here, and it's very, very evident. And you can catch that in the light. But since this right here is going to be covered up by where the sonar sits in that bulbous part of the bow, there's no need to worry about that. We can visit later if that's causing any alignment issues when we glue those pieces on. But for the time being, we don't have to worry about that there at all. So then, just similar to as we did on the other side, we're going to go ahead and mark down that entire long mold seam all the way down the center of the hole. I run my fingers along the hole. I'm going to check to see if there's any more that aren't actually molded on detail. Let's see if we can pick up and discover any more. So far, so good until we reach right here, which is just like the other side. We've got this right here. That is the seam line. I'm going to go ahead and mark that out. Now, this right here does not carry all the way through to right here. In fact, this right here looks like it was a separate piece of the mold, and the seam goes right across that. So we'll just kind of go up. And we want to make sure when we are sanding this out that we don't catch this here in the process. It looks like that might be for attaching the propeller shaft. So we definitely don't want to mess that up. All right, so again, we're going to find our mold seams and mark them out with a pencil. All righty. And again, as we're going, I find it best to mark both sides just to make sure that I'm sanding inside there. And all the way around to the stern. So on here, what we need to be careful of is we don't mess this area up too much. And it's identical as over here. And what that is that's going to be where the parts that support the prop and the shaft sit. That's where they sit inside the hole, and that's going to be gluing points. So we don't want to mess these up. We don't want to make these any larger, alter the shape of this in any way. Otherwise, it might make for an uneven fit or a part that's too loose in there. So go ahead and finish marking this up. And then we'll begin sanding. Okay, so we're going to start off our sanding process here with something I found a long time ago is rating the health and beauty area of department stores or drugstores can yield great results for sanding sticks. This right here came out of the nail care section at a CVS pharmacy. So this right here feels about 250 grit and is a perfect way to start off with getting rid of some of these large sprue nibs and getting this mold seam knocked back just a little bit. Now beware, a lot of these come in two different grits. On the other side that's much heavier, maybe like 180 grit. This right here though is more like a 250, maybe even a little bit better than that. So just sit back and check it out. Alrighty. I did about half of the sanding with this first sanding stick off camera. The hole is so big that sometimes you really have to position it awkwardly and able to get to some of those spots, some of the difficult to reach areas, and make sure you're able to sand them adequately. Also, I have several of these because you can get them in large packs. And I was able to cut one up, so I've got several of these really nice thin ones here. So it was helpful to get into small spaces like this, where I've got a lot of surrounding detail, and just use it kind of finely and in little minute back and forth strokes without destroying any of the surrounding detail. It was also very helpful here toward the stern, where that slight mold seam was. So I get that all the way around and all the way down. Now it still looks like you can see some of the pore stubs. If you rub your fingernail across them, it feels smooth. It just looks like a bad thing. We're going to have to put some kind of a paint or a primer over that to see if there's anything there after all the sanding has been completed. One other thing I wanted to point out also is as you get up here, it starts to round. So you want to make sure you take great care so you don't ruin any kind of contours. It's really, really a kind of a sharp angle right here on the sides of the hole. So you don't want to put too much pressure on there. You want to go kind of nice and easy on that, so you don't have this great big flat spot right there. Also up here, I was able to do some of that with a smaller sanding stick, but one thing that really came into handy here was this, to me, a sanding sponge. This is a 400 grit sanding sponge, and it's nice for little areas like this, where there's a lot of contour meeting up with other contour. So you can just sit there and slowly, very gently kind of sand right there, and that'll help eliminate that mold seam. I found that very helpful. Very helpful in all instances where I had any kind of a tight space, tight squeeze with the kind of contours and rounded edges. So this worked out very nicely. So the next one I will be going to will be a 400 grit sanding sponge, and this will kind of help eliminate some of these scratch marks. As you sand with pretty much anything larger grit than a 400 grit, you're going to get some scratch marks in there, and those scratch marks will show up through the paint. You can faintly see some of those toward the back here, and sometimes they show up as just really thin white lines, but those will definitely come through in the final paint job. You definitely want to make sure you get rid of all of your sanding seams or your sanding marks. So as you can see, I'm just kind of the same way I was doing with that. I'm going to go a little bit back and forth and a little bit kind of diagonal perpendicular to where I was sanding here. Another thing I was also doing here is when I was sanding this before with the heavier grit, I was sanding diagonally in this direction. Well, with the 400 grit, I will sand diagonally in the opposite direction. I kind of help go against some of those sanding marks, kind of help eliminate those and blend this area a little bit more smoothly into the hole. It's all right to go outside of your pencil lines here to blend that area further into what you weren't sanding before. And this will also kind of help really smooth that transition down nicely. So hope you stick around. I will finish up with the 400 grit. Okie doke. I have gone ahead and hit everywhere with the 400 grit sanding stick and 400 grit Tamiya sanding sponge, and has really taken care of almost all of the heavy sanding marks, heavy sanding lines. The only thing that the 400 leaves behind is just a different texture than the rest of the plastic. So at this point, I'm going to go back over everything lightly with some 600 grit sanding sticks on any of the seam lines or anywhere where I need sharp corners. And then I'm also going to use a 600 grit sanding sponge to hit some of these curvier areas, and again, feather the edge of where I sanded into the rest of the plastic. Again, those will also come in handy right up here toward the front. As you can see, everything is nice and smooth back here. We start to lose any of the ability to spot where some of those mold seams were, some of those steps were, just through the sanding with a heavy sanding stick and then the sanding with a 400 grit sanding sponge and sanding stick. One thing I wanted to point out while I'm here, if you're building this ship, or for that matter, any other ship models that have a sharp bow, one thing I noticed is while I was maneuvering this piece around, I hit this very tip into something. And it didn't break off, thankfully, but it did develop a little bit of a bend. I was able to bend it back without any further damage or any problem. But what I would definitely recommend is getting maybe a piece of foam, some of the old packaging from the I Love kit, and putting it back around there, taping it in place when you're not actively working with that area. Possibly even this corner right here might be a good idea as you're going to start getting more and more stuff and odds and ends put onto this. That's another opportunity to break something very easily when you're reaching around and you're handling the model. So, but for starters right now, while you might think that this is just rough work, that can easily break off if you hit that into something. So beware. I'm going to go ahead and hit this with the 600 grit off camera, and we'll be right back to have another look at it. Alrighty, so this is the state of the hull after using a 600 grit sanding stick and my 600 grit Tamiya sanding sponge. And if we can see here, there is not a very sharp line, any kind of distinction between where I sanded and where the plastic is untouched, which is really nice. It feels really good, really smooth, no discernible sanding marks. And that is the reason why I step up from heavy grit to very fine grit. And you do so in stages like that, you're able to eliminate all of your sanding marks, and you're able to have a really nice feathered edge out to the area that has been untouched by any modification you've made. So that's where we're at now. My last step here is just going to be, I'm going to skip the 800 grit sanding stick and go right to 1000. I've got a sponge that matches this grit as well. And it's just going to be a quick, brief pass over everything just to make sure, because before I put down primer, I want the best surface I can put on this with primer. The one concern is still these little sprue gate marks here. So I'm gonna have to see how those show up after the primer. Primer is the one thing that reveals all. Any kind of problems or defects, anywhere you need to touch up or fix, will come up in the primer. So I'm going to go ahead and proceed with 1000 grit, and we'll be back here in just a minute. Alrighty, so I have completed my sanding. I am very pleased with the end result here. It's, again, very, very hard unless I've got really bright lighting on, which the camera doesn't appreciate. But unless I've got that really bright light, I'm not easily able to tell where I sanded and where I didn't sand. The edge is feathered so well, and the stepped increase in grit and the finer grade really, really took this home, made it look very nice. So real happy. Again, 1000 grit Tamiya sanding sponge and 1000 grit sanding stick. Manufacturer unknown. So the next thing I wanted to accomplish in this video was to get these parts right here, A1, A2, attached up there, because I'm going to have to blend those into the hull. That's supposed to look seamless, and that's the way I want it to be. The rest of this stuff does not have to be seamless, since there's natural junctions and intersections where those parts would lie and where that would be in real life. There's not a seamless blend into the hull like there would be with these two pieces here. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that sprue and take a look at these parts. There's A1 and 2. What we can do here is, for me, I like to get the parts out of the sprue and away from the sprue and other parts, get the sprue out of the way so that it's easy for me to maneuver my cutters or nippers, whatever your terminology is, so that I can get in closer. It allows me a lot more control over where I'm cutting, so I have less cleanup and a cleaner cut. Something to be mentioned on that as well is that the cleaner and more controlled cuts are going to lead to less plastic deformation after you cut. So for instance, if you take any piece of plastic sprue, we'll even take a chunk out of the A sprue here. You can even see right where I've cut already, there's deformation right there. That white part is where the plastic has not cut cleanly, but more or less kind of either torn or been a little bent and rendered from the cutting action of the nippers. So one of the nice things about these parts on that sprue was the attachment points are offset. I don't know if you can see that really well. Oh, yeah, you can. Right there you can see that the attachment point is offset, meaning that if I come along here, lay this flat against the edge of the part and slowly cut, most of that is gone. I know there's still a nice tag hanging out here, but again, real nice and slowly. Now I've got minimal cleanup. This is going to be the same here in the back. Very nice, very slowly. Trying to get as little plastic bending and deforming due to the action of these nippers. Same thing up here. And when it's on a curved part like this, I generally try to even still go just a touch away from the part. That will allow me the freedom to be able to sand this and maintain the curve. Rather than if I push this right up against the part and cut it clean off, that might result in a flat spot. A flat spot is then I'm going to have to put some putty on it or some kind of filler on it just to try to get that rounded again. This is supposed to be perfectly rounded, not no kind of smooth line or straight line or anything like that. So same thing for these parts over here. Standing off just a touch. The attachment points like this, when the manufacturers offset them like this, is really nice. It really ends up being a lot easier to clean up these sprue attachment points. See, that one right there was so close and so nice that it took almost the entire sprue attachment point off. There's only these fine little hairs right there. So with that, before I do any cleanup, I'm going to kind of see how these go together, just to get a rough idea. You can see there are pins and holes that are supposed to line these up properly. And for the most part, they should line up and they should fit together. As many nice things as I've said about this kit, it is trying to fight me right now on this. So let's see what's going on here. Oops. Sorry about that, folks. One of the things with curvy pieces like this, when you're trying to put stuff together, sometimes things manage to slip off. So that's what happened with one of the halves of this. It slipped off. So they do fit together pretty well without any bad steps or anything. They're not 100% together all the way because I still have quite a bit of cleanup to go on these points. You can say it with a grain of salt because it's actually not that bad of cleanup due to the offset attachment points. But it doesn't feel like there's any step here. If I take my fingernail and perpendicular to the surface and go rub it back and forth perpendicular to that seam, it doesn't feel like there's any large step. And that's kind of going around the entire way. And what that does for me, what that tells me is that the pieces are lining up pretty well with the attachment pins and attachment holes. And these are attached, and it means that they will go together and should provide you good alignment on the parts when they're cleaned up and smashed together. So I'm going to go ahead and clean up these attachment points. I'm going to assume if you have bought this kit and you're working on it, or you're following along with me, and you've worked on models before, you know how to do this on your own. So see you in a minute. All righty. Thanks for waiting. I'm back. I know it wasn't really a big wait for you, but for me, that took some time to clean up all these screw attachment points. Everything nice and flat and flush on both pieces, especially when there's alignment pins. You really have to go around those if you're going to trust the alignment pins to make sure that the parts fit together properly. So in this case, after I did so, you go together nice, a little snug, but that's okay because they're not coming apart. And once they're together, when I'm ready to glue this, I won't have to hold them together. The parts will hold themselves together and the glue will just seep in there as it should. So one thing I did do that I didn't explain I was going to do was, while I was kind of touching these together, I went ahead and sanded one small spot just to make sure that there was no step. And as it turns out, there is a very, very slight step. But it's so slight that just a little bit of sanding should take care of it. Once we sand that, similar to how we did with the hole, we should be able to step up the grades of sanding so it's super fine by the end, and then use some primer, and no one will ever know that there was ever a step or a mold seam there. It should look like one part. And then with that, I've got the hole here. This fits on there beautifully. It's going to take a little bit of alignment just to make sure that things line up, because we don't want, of course, we don't want a step like that. That's very much exaggerated, but if we put that back, we make sure that that's a nice smooth transition. It looks good in the back. That sits on there the way it should. When things and parts like this line up the way they should, especially very difficult and parts with contours, a lot of curves, line up like this so well, it makes the job so much easier to clean up and make that seam disappear. That's ultimately what we're after, and that's what I can definitely applaud the kit designers and manufacturers for in this case. That looks wonderful. So I'm going to go ahead and get this glued together. These are larger assemblies, not those small, teeny tiny little detail pieces. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is use the thicker Model Master liquid cement for plastic models. I've had this bottle for years. I don't use it very often because it just only comes in handy when you've got larger assemblies like this that you're going to let cure over a day or two, just to let that plastic fully melt to each other, and then you're going to let it sit. So all that has time to evaporate off, and it's going to dissolve the plastic, it's going to fuse the parts together, and then it's going to evaporate off. Usually 24 hours should be long enough to make sure that that is going to be a very solid hold. That said, I have to make sure this is coming out. Oh, sorry about that, folks. Like I said, this bottle has lasted me forever. It's because I don't use it very often, so the tip was a little bit clogged. All I had to do was take a really fine piece of wire, insert it in the end, and that knocked the clog loose, and glue is coming out easily now. So we'll go ahead and put some glue on here. Very sparingly, very sparingly. And the reason why we go very sparingly is you don't want this oozing out of the ends and making a great big mess in case your hands or your fingers come across it. It's going to drag it across the rest of the part. And that will then make another headache to take care of as far as sanding goes. More sanding, more finishing. So try to be very sparing. And all we're doing is applying this. I usually try to steer toward the inside of the mating parts or the inside of the mating surfaces. So I'm going to let this sit for a couple seconds. I'm going to blow on it a little bit. In fact, I don't know why I do that. I don't know if it actually helps or does anything, but it's something that I've just always done. Maybe it helps. Maybe it doesn't. All right. And with that, we'll go ahead and put these parts together. And that is most excellent because none of the glue oozed out. We'll look on the inside here. No, I'm sorry, the lighting's a little difficult. That part is very deep and very narrow opening. Well, it does not look at all like we've got any glue oozing out, which is outstanding. So the last thing we're going to do for this episode is we're going to put some glue onto the hole right here. Not onto the hole. We're going to put this part onto the hole. We're going to put the glue on this though. If I put the glue down here on the mating edge right there, then it'll definitely ooze out all over the place. Or if I'm putting this down and I'm not real careful and I slip, it's going to drag glue somewhere into the hole. So I don't want that. I'm going to put glue very sparingly onto the part itself, and then I'm going to sit this part down onto the hull. So again, toward the inside. And this is one of those cases, because you've got a nice rebate here where that goes, you can actually even put the glue into the corner, a little bit onto the actual mating edge, but into the corner as well. And that will help you achieve a much more significant bond with the piece that we're going to put this onto. Again, blowing, not sure why, but maybe there's some scientist out there that says, hey, you know what? That does the trick. Maybe there's a whole bunch of experienced modelers that says you don't know what you're talking about. Go ahead and that as carefully as I can. There we go. I'm going to make sure it's lined up. Feels good. It feels flush with the rest of the hull. That looks right. It feels a little bit proud, but I'm okay with this being just a touch proud, just for the simple fact that eventually I'm going to have to go in and I'm going to have to sand this. There is just the slightest gap right there. Not much on that side, but just the very slightest gap right there. And we're still going to have to try to blend this to make it as seamless as possible. So I'm okay with that because through the sanding process is a very sharp edge. If I sanded this, if I made this as flush with that as possible, and this was as sharp of an edge as this, and I was sanding on this part a bunch, then that edge on this would shrink back, and then I'd have to sand this, and you see what happens, back and forth, until we're losing too much plastic that to be comfortable with. So far, so good. This looks good. It feels good. It feels like it's setting up. The part's not falling off, so it means it's seated in there nicely. It's nestled in there nicely. One thing that may be of concern, and I've got to check references, is this may be more of a case where this comes down more like this and flattens out, rather than this just smooth angle all the way up till the curve. I'll have to check out references and see what I can find. It's possible it was even modified later on. Most of the pictures you find of Arleigh guided missile destroyers and the Curtis Wilbur are of later, in year 2000 and on. And the destroyer here is supposed to be in the 90s, mid 90s to late 90s. And that actually brings up another excellent point. I've seen many modelers do this where they add an oil canning effect to their model ships. Either on the hull or the superstructure or both. But the time period when this was depicted, and I did look online at a lot of different pictures and references, while there is some oil canning present in the 90s, it was very, very minimal, almost not noticeable, and depending on the angle, completely not there at all. It's definitely present right around 2016, 2017, 2018 on those pictures. And that's just due to metal fatigue. The hull is crashing through waves. The skin of this is taking a lot of beating from water. A lot more metal fatigue as the metal heats up and expands, or it cools off and contracts. That's the metal fatigue. And so that causes those stresses in the skin of these vessels, and what causes that oil canning effect. Well, so apparently when this model is depicted, allegedly when it's depicted, is going to be new enough that the oil canning is going to be almost non-existent anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and not even concern myself with trying to put any kind of an effect on there about that. At most, if after some consideration we want to do that, there might be just some very faint lines to show where weld beads are. But we'll see. Again, at this scale, 1/200, it's going to be so small and microscopic that, one, if I put it on there, it may be overdone and out of scale, or two, it may be so not noticeable that it's not even worth putting the time and effort into, because if we were going to do it, it would either be through using stretch sprue and gluing that on, or through just applying various masks and leaving really thin exposed portions and applying a couple coats of primer and then pulling the masks off, leaving very, very slightly exposed little lines. All in all, either method is a lot of work. So it's going to be a little bit of a thought process for me to see if it's worth doing at all. But I don't know. We might revisit the topic here on a next video or two. At that point, though, we reached the half-hour mark. At least I'm good for this episode. This has to dry. This has to cure. Take its time. I don't want to go any further because I could misalign this or knock it loose. So, of course, I thank you all very much for joining me. Until next time, take care.